It begins in the quiet moments. No loud confrontations, no final words, just an unexpected pause, a silence that stretches on far longer than you expect. At first, you might confuse it with confusion. The emptiness seems like a void, but it's not. It's a shift, one that's happening beneath the surface, even if you can't see it yet. Silence doesn't stand still. It moves. It rearranges power, control, and emotions in ways that words never could. In that stillness, the one who once had the upper hand starts to feel the weight of their own distance. And the one who was always chasing for validation begins to find breath again. But most can't stand this phase. They rush to break it, to fix it, to fill the space with noise. They think silence means defeat. But silence isn't weakness, it's strategy. It's a powerful mirror that reveals who you truly are without the distraction of reaction. And while the world might think silence is nothing, it's everything. It's the moment when the ego, once so strong, begins to tremble. You'll feel it in the smallest details. The phone that stays dark, the message you almost send but don't. That impulse to reach out but choosing not to. That's not submission, it's strength being sharpened. That's stoicism in action, standing still while the world around you seems to spiral. Silence doesn't beg for attention, it draws the truth to the surface. It's the place where both egos, yours and theirs, are forced to face what's real, without distraction. Silence exposes motives. It exposes ego. It exposes what was built on fear instead of genuine connection. And while one side may act from a place of distance and detachment, the other side learns to stop chasing what should have been freely given. When you don't move, when you don't chase or explain or beg, your absence does the talking for you. And slowly, what was once a source of control begins to lose its grip. What people fail to realize is that silence doesn't punish, it transforms. It's not about making the other person feel regret or pain. It's about realigning yourself, finding peace without external validation. Silence doesn't need to prove a thing. It simply is, and that in itself is a powerful statement. As the silence stretches, the mind that once thrived on quick responses, validation, and constant reassurance starts to break free from those chains. It's not easy. It's uncomfortable at first. The impulse to check your phone, to send that message, to make them see you still care, it will rise. But in this moment, you choose not to respond. You choose to remain still. And that's where the real transformation happens. Not in the grand gestures, not in the dramatic confrontations, but in the quiet, in the moments of restraint. Because silence doesn't destroy you, it clears away what no longer serves you. In the silence, you see your ego for what it truly is, a defense mechanism built to protect you from vulnerability. The ego wants reaction. It wants control. It wants to be seen and heard. But silence teaches you to detach from that need. It reveals your attachments and your fears without judgment. The truth is, silence is not an absence of communication. It's the presence of reality. It forces you to look at things you didn't want to see. Every unread message, every delay, every silence, these aren't rejections. They're lessons. The more you hold your silence, the clearer it becomes. You no longer need to explain yourself to feel whole. You don't need to chase love, attention, or validation. You learn that your worth isn't determined by someone else's response. Your peace is yours to protect, not to beg for. On the other side, the one who sought control through avoidance, through detachment, begins to feel their own version of discomfort. The silence they once thought gave them power now starts to feel like a weight they can't carry. They check their phone more, wondering why you haven't reached out. They start replaying old messages, trying to piece together what they've missed. The silence that was supposed to give them strength now begins to expose their fragility. And that's the beauty of silence. It doesn't break you. It doesn't make you weak. It forces you to look inward, to face the parts of yourself that were once hidden by noise. It teaches you that you don't need to control others to feel at peace. The only control you need is over yourself. In the end, silence doesn't collapse relationships. It dissolves the illusion of control. It brings both sides face to face with their own fears, insecurities, and attachments. And it teaches you that true power doesn't come from control, it comes from surrender. Surrendering to the quiet, surrendering to what is without the need to explain or react. This is the moment when silence becomes your greatest strength. You no longer need to prove anything. You no longer need to be understood. You simply exist, and in that existence, you find peace. That's the power of silence. It's not the absence of noise, it's the presence of everything that truly matters. In the midst of this silence, something shifts within you. It's as though the world has suddenly become quieter, not in a way that feels empty or oppressive, but in a way that begins to reveal all the things you were too distracted to notice before. There's a newfound awareness of the space you inhabit, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally as well. It's as if you've stepped outside the noise of your own thoughts and are now able to observe them from a distance. And what you begin to see is both unsettling and liberating. You realize how often your sense of self was shaped by external validation, by the messages, the responses, the likes, and the affirmations you received from others. You may have built your identity around the approval and attention you received. It was subtle at first, perhaps barely noticeable. But over time, you became accustomed to this cycle of seeking external acknowledgement to feel whole, to feel loved, to feel seen. This cycle, while comfortable in its predictability, never allowed you to truly know yourself. It kept you tethered to an external world, a world that could never truly satisfy the deeper cravings of your soul. In the silence, all of that begins to fade away. The need for others to validate your worth slips into the background. The desperate search for external recognition becomes less urgent, and in its place emerges a quiet, steady understanding that your worth was never dependent on anyone's approval. This realization is jarring, but it's also profoundly freeing. The absence of constant feedback, of constant noise, begins to feel like a weight being lifted off your shoulders. It's like stepping into a vast open space where there are no expectations, no demands, and no external measures of success. The silence stretches around you like an open sky, and for the first time in a long time, you can breathe without feeling the pressure to perform, to explain, or to prove. It's not that you stop caring about the world around you, but you stop looking to it for your sense of self-worth. You start to understand that validation is not the key to fulfillment. True fulfillment comes from within. But this doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual process, one that requires patience, reflection, and a willingness to sit with discomfort. Silence isn't easy. It's a mirror that reflects back everything you've been running from, your insecurities, your fears, your attachments. It's impossible to ignore them in the stillness, and so you are forced to confront them. At first, these confrontations can feel like a battle. The ego, which has spent so much time maintaining control and self-protection, begins to fight back. It whispers, "You can't just let go. What if they never come back? What if you never find anyone who makes you feel this way again?" It latches onto the fear of abandonment, of being forgotten, of losing connection. And at times, it will be hard to resist. The urge to reach out, to break the silence, to restore the sense of normalcy, this impulse will surge within you. You will feel it like a wave crashing inside your chest. But as you sit with it, you begin to realize that this urge is not a call to action. It's simply a reaction to the discomfort of not knowing. It's the ego trying to regain control, to return to the safety of what it knows. But in this space, you've learned that control isn't the answer. And so, you let the wave pass. You breathe through it. You remind yourself that silence isn't a void. It's a space where everything that was once hidden begins to surface. And here's the paradox. The more you stay in this silence, the more you begin to see how little power the ego actually has. It's not as strong as it once seemed. It's a fragile construct built on fears and illusions. It crumbles when you stop feeding it. It withers when you refuse to react, when you refuse to engage in the old patterns of behavior that once kept it alive. You start to see your emotional triggers more clearly. You notice how, in the past, you would chase after attention to soothe the hurt in your heart. You would seek confirmation to fill the emptiness inside. You realize that you were never truly fulfilled by these things. They only masked the deeper longing for self-acceptance, for peace, for connection to something greater than yourself. In the silence, you begin to reconnect with that deeper part of yourself, the part that isn't dependent on others. You begin to hear your own voice more clearly, not the voice that seeks approval, but the one that simply is. The more you sit in this space, the more you realize that the things you thought you needed, validation, attention, recognition, were distractions. They were the noise that kept you from hearing your own truth. And in this truth, you find a kind of peace that is unlike anything you've ever known. It's not a peace that comes from external circumstances. It's a peace that comes from within, from a deep understanding that you are enough as you are. There is no need to chase after anything. There is nothing to prove. You are whole. And in this wholeness, you find your power. The silence is no longer something you fear. It's a space you inhabit with comfort, with ease. It is the ground where your strength grows. In the quiet, the ego's voice grows softer, quieter. It still tries to speak, to provoke, to make you doubt yourself, but it no longer holds the same power. You no longer feel the need to defend yourself, to explain, to convince anyone of your worth. The silence has taught you that your worth doesn't need to be proven, it simply is. And so, as the days pass, you find yourself not longing for noise anymore. You don't need to fill the space with words. You don't need to check your phone to see if they've reached out. You don't need to wonder if they're thinking of you. You stop measuring your value by external standards. You stop looking outside yourself for approval. What happens next is something subtle, yet profound. The dynamic shifts. What was once a game of push and pull, of chasing and retreating, begins to dissolve. The power struggle is no longer there. The silence that once felt heavy now feels like freedom. You've stopped looking for answers, and in doing so, you've become the answer. You've become the stillness, the peace, the power. The other person, the one who once thrived on creating distance, begins to feel the shift too. At first, they might think nothing has changed. But as time passes, they'll start to wonder why you haven't reached out. They'll check their phone, replay old conversations, look for signs that you still care. And they'll begin to feel the absence. They'll feel it in the way the air seems thicker, the silence more pronounced. The truth is, silence works both ways. It doesn't just expose your own fears and insecurities, it also exposes theirs. The one who once pulled away to feel in control now feels the weight of their own detachment. What they thought was safety now feels like isolation. The silence that they created as a shield begins to feel like a mirror reflecting their own vulnerabilities. And so, in this shared silence, both egos begin to break down. The avoidant person begins to realize that silence doesn't guarantee control. It brings up questions, doubts, and discomfort. Their once confident detachment begins to waver. They start to feel the absence in a way they never expected. Meanwhile, you, who have learned to sit with your own silence, who have learned to trust your own stillness, begin to notice something new. You begin to notice that you're not looking for anything anymore. You're not waiting for anyone to come back. You're not hoping for a message, a call, a sign of affection. You've become the embodiment of the silence itself, strong, centered, unshaken. This is the final collapse of the ego, when you stop needing anything to feel whole, when you realize that you are always enough, even in the silence. And in that moment, you understand the true power of stillness. It's not something that happens to you. It's something you choose. The silence that once felt like withdrawal, like pain, now feels like a deep, abiding peace. You realize that nothing outside of you can take that away. It's yours to keep, yours to protect. The ego no longer has a hold over you because you've stepped outside of its grip. You no longer need to perform or react. You simply are. And in that being, you find your strength. In the quiet, in the stillness, in the absence of noise, you finally meet the truest version of yourself. And this version doesn't need to chase, doesn't need to prove, doesn't need to explain. It simply exists, powerful, whole, and free. As the silence deepens, it begins to reveal its true nature. It's not just an absence of sound, but a profound presence that can shift the course of your life. It's in this quiet space that the lessons of Stoicism unfold, not as abstract concepts, but as lived experiences, felt deeply and understood in the marrow of your bones. Silence isn't a passive state. It's active, dynamic, and transformative. It's in the silence that you finally learn to stand firm in your own center, not swayed by the currents of external validation or reaction. At first, you may struggle with the emptiness of it all. The silence feels alien, unsettling even. It's a pause, yes, but it's a heavy pause, filled with the weight of unspoken words, unresolved emotions, and the echo of old patterns. But that discomfort is exactly what makes silence so powerful. It forces you to confront the things you would normally distract yourself from. It strips away the crutches you once relied on to feel secure. No more messages, no more likes, no more external sources of affirmation to tell you who you are. In the absence of all these things, you begin to see yourself for the first time without distortion. It's a painful process at first. It's like peeling away layers of skin, each layer a part of your old self that you thought defined you. You realize that so much of who you were, who you thought you had to be, was based on external influences, on the need to be seen, to be needed, to be validated. And now, in the silence, all of that falls away. But here's where the real transformation begins. You start to see how much strength was hidden beneath all that noise. You begin to realize that all those external validations, all that chasing after someone else's approval, was never the source of your power. In fact, it was a distraction, a barrier to true self-empowerment. The more you sit in the silence, the more you become aware of your own inherent strength. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. But it's steady, unwavering, and unshakable. In the silence, you no longer feel the need to defend yourself. You stop justifying your actions, explaining your feelings, or seeking validation for who you are. The impulse to do so diminishes as the days pass, and in its place, a quiet confidence begins to grow. You no longer seek to prove anything to anyone. You stop playing the games you once played, the games that were designed to validate your worth. You realize that your worth is already inherent, already present, and nothing outside of you can change that. This is when the silence truly becomes a teacher. It's teaching you that you're enough as you are. It's teaching you that you don't need to chase anyone's attention or approval. It's teaching you that peace isn't found in the noise, it's found in the stillness. And that stillness is powerful, not because it's empty, but because it's full of all the wisdom and truth that has been hidden beneath the surface for so long. As you settle deeper into the silence, something remarkable begins to happen. The ego, which once clung desperately to control, starts to weaken. You no longer feel the same need to manage every interaction, to dictate the course of events, or to ensure that everything goes according to plan. The desire for control, which once fueled your every move, begins to fade into the background, like a whisper growing softer and softer until it's nothing more than a faint memory. This collapse of the ego's need for control is one of the most profound shifts you will experience. For much of your life, you may have believed that control was the key to security, that by managing the details, by orchestrating your environment, you could ensure that things went your way. You believed that by controlling your reactions, by controlling the people around you, you could maintain your sense of stability. But the silence, with its gentle yet firm insistence, teaches you that control is an illusion. You begin to realize that control doesn't bring peace, it brings anxiety. It creates tension because the more you try to control things, the more you are reminded of how little control you actually have. The silence, on the other hand, shows you a different way of being. It shows you that peace is found not in controlling everything around you, but in letting go of the need to control it all. Letting go is not about giving up or surrendering to chaos. It's about releasing the false belief that you can dictate every outcome. It's about accepting that you are not the master of the universe and that the universe doesn't need to be mastered. It's about trusting that things will unfold as they are meant to, and that your role is not to manipulate those outcomes, but to respond to them with wisdom, grace, and clarity. This is where the true strength of Stoicism comes in. Stoicism is not about suppressing your emotions or denying your desires. It's about understanding that you cannot control the external world, but you can control your response to it. Silence, in this sense, becomes a powerful tool for mastering your reactions. It teaches you that you don't need to respond to every stimulus, to every provocation. You don't need to react with emotion, with impulsive action, or with a need to make things right. Sometimes, the best response is no response at all. When you stop trying to control everything, you begin to see the beauty in surrender. Surrender doesn't mean weakness. It doesn't mean giving up. It means letting go of the illusion that you can dictate the course of events and instead embracing the flow of life as it comes. You begin to trust that, no matter what happens, you will be okay. This is the essence of true inner peace, not trying to control the outcome, but being at peace with whatever the outcome may be. As the ego continues to collapse, something extraordinary begins to emerge: the subtle power of stillness. It's not the absence of action, but the presence of purpose. It's the quiet confidence that comes from knowing that you don't need to do anything to prove your worth. It's the inner strength that comes from knowing that you are not defined by your actions, your achievements, or the opinions of others. You are defined by who you are, and that is enough. This stillness is not passive. It is not about withdrawing from the world or shutting yourself off from others. It is about standing firm in your own truth, in your own peace, regardless of what's happening around you. It's about being present in the moment without the need to control, manipulate, or chase after external validation. It's about embracing the quiet power that comes from simply being without the need to do anything more. In the stillness, you begin to see the world differently. You see people not as objects to be controlled or manipulated, but as individuals on their own journeys. You begin to understand that you cannot change anyone but yourself, and that is where your true power lies. You learn to let go of the need to fix, to save, or to control others. You realize that the most powerful thing you can do is to be a living example of peace, of strength, and of wisdom. The more you settle into the stillness, the more you realize that it's the key to everything you've been seeking. You don't need to chase after success or approval. You don't need to be anyone other than who you are in this moment. The stillness brings you back to your true self, to the part of you that is unshakable, unbreakable, and complete. As the silence continues to stretch, it begins to evolve. At first, it's discomforting, like an uninvited guest in your life. It was a space that you didn't know how to fill, a gap in your routine that felt like loss. But over time, you realize that what you once feared is now the very source of your transformation. The silence doesn't just contain your thoughts, it organizes them. It's like stepping into a room with no furniture, only to find that it is the emptiness that gives you the space to breathe deeply, to see clearly, and to finally align yourself with the life you've always wanted to live. In this silence, you begin to witness the quiet collapse of fear. Fear was always at the root of your actions: fear of being alone, of being unloved, of being unimportant. Fear told you to keep chasing, to keep striving, to keep proving yourself to others. Fear fueled the ego, pushing you to seek attention, to need constant validation, to act out of insecurity rather than confidence. But now, as the silence lingers, fear starts to lose its grip. You begin to notice the subtleties: the absence of that anxious need to check your phone, to send a message, to get a reply. The overwhelming compulsion to fill the silence with words, with activity, with something, anything, becomes less and less urgent. Fear, once a driving force, starts to quiet itself. The more you sit with the silence, the more you realize that fear doesn't define you. It's only a fleeting reaction, a learned response to a world that encouraged you to chase after things that were never truly meant for you. What you discover in this stillness is freedom. Freedom from the demands of the ego. Freedom from the need to constantly seek approval from others. In the absence of external validation, you start to feel a quiet sense of power. It's not a power over others, it's a power over yourself. It's the power to stand in your own truth without apology, without needing anyone else to agree with you or confirm your worth. This freedom comes not from escaping the world or withdrawing from relationships, but from learning how to be whole within yourself. When you no longer seek external validation, when you stop chasing the fleeting applause of others, you finally give yourself the space to become who you were always meant to be. You stop being defined by your past, by your mistakes, by your successes, or by your failures. In the silence, you just are. And that in itself is the greatest form of power. As you lean deeper into this freedom, you realize that the world around you hasn't changed. What has changed is your relationship to it. Where you once sought to control the world, you now find peace in simply observing it, in allowing it to flow around you. Your sense of self-worth is no longer attached to the outcomes of your efforts. You no longer need to constantly chase after validation from others because you found that your worth was never dependent on them in the first place. It was always within you. There's a strange thing that happens when you embrace the stillness. The illusions that once seemed so real begin to unravel. The ego, which was built on layers of fear, pride, and validation seeking, starts to reveal itself for what it truly is: a fragile construct, a house of cards, built on the shifting sands of external circumstances. You begin to see through the facade of the ego, the mask it wore to protect itself from the vulnerability of being seen as imperfect, as human. The ego has always been a defense mechanism, an armor designed to shield you from the discomfort of uncertainty and rejection. But in the silence, this armor starts to rust. It's not an immediate collapse, it's more like the slow, inevitable wear of something that can no longer withstand the pressure of its own lies. The ego begins to show its cracks, and what once seemed like a pillar of strength becomes a fragile tower teetering on the edge of collapse. You start to recognize the patterns, the moments when you would overcompensate to gain approval, the times when you'd mask your vulnerabilities with bravado or arrogance. You see how much of your identity was tied to how others saw you, how much of your self-worth was based on external feedback. In the quiet of the silence, these illusions begin to lose their power. You realize that you never needed to prove anything to anyone. You were always whole, always enough, always worthy of love and acceptance, regardless of whether anyone else saw it. It's an incredibly liberating realization, but it's also one that is difficult to accept at first. There's a part of you that wants to fight against it, to defend the ego, to cling to those old stories of who you thought you were. But in the silence, you can no longer hide from the truth. The more you face it, the more you realize that the ego, with all its grand illusions of control and strength, is nothing but a fleeting moment in the grand scheme of your life. And that's when you begin to understand the true meaning of freedom, not as the ability to control everything around you, but as the ability to control how you respond to what happens. Freedom is not in manipulating the world to fit your desires. It's in surrendering to the flow of life and accepting whatever comes, knowing that you are enough as you are, no matter the circumstances. It's paradoxical, really, the way that true mastery over yourself comes not through control, but through surrender. For so long, you believed that control was the path to strength, that the more you could manage your emotions, your relationships, and your environment, the more in control you would feel. But silence has taught you the opposite. The more you try to control, the more you fight against the natural flow of life, the more you distance yourself from your true power. Control is an illusion, a mental construct designed to keep you feeling safe. But in the silence, you learn that safety doesn't come from controlling your environment or the people around you. It comes from within. It comes from trusting that no matter what happens, you can handle it. You don't need to manipulate the situation to guarantee a specific outcome. You simply need to trust yourself enough to face whatever comes next. In this trust, there is power. It's the power of knowing that you don't need to fight or struggle to be okay. You don't need to push, pull, or force. You simply need to breathe and allow things to unfold. The more you practice this surrender, the more you begin to feel the weight of the world lift off your shoulders. You stop trying to control every detail, every outcome, and you start to embrace the beauty of letting go. And in this letting go, you become stronger. Because true strength is not in holding on, it's in releasing. It's in letting go of the need to manipulate, the need to control, the need to cling to old patterns of behavior that no longer serve you. The more you surrender, the more you come to realize that your peace and strength were never tied to external outcomes, they were always within you. As you continue to embrace silence and surrender, you begin to understand the art of non-reaction. This is one of the most difficult lessons because for so long, you've been conditioned to react to everything, to react to emotions, to situations, to the behavior of others. You've been taught that reacting is normal, even necessary. But silence teaches you something different, that true power lies in your ability to choose your response, or more often, not to respond at all. Non-reaction is not about indifference. It's not about shutting yourself off from the world or pretending that things don't matter. It's about having the inner strength to pause, to take a step back, and to choose whether or not to engage with something that doesn't serve your peace. It's about realizing that you don't have to respond to every stimulus, that you can let some things pass without internalizing them or allowing them to disturb your equilibrium. In this space, you begin to master your inner peace. You learn that your emotions don't have to dictate your actions. You don't have to react to anger with anger, to frustration with frustration, or to hurt with more hurt. You realize that your emotional state doesn't have to be influenced by external circumstances. You can choose how you feel, how you respond, and how you navigate the world. And this power, this choice, becomes one of the greatest gifts of silence.